Well, hello, everyone. Welcome and happy Women's History Month. What a great way to celebrate. On behalf of women at Bain, Asians at Bain, and Bain's global alumni community, welcome to this episode of Bain's Alumni Spotlight Series. We're thrilled to have you here today for this event, which is part of our broader alumni speaker series that highlights the incredible achievements of Bain alumni from all across the globe. We're thrilled to be joined by both Bainees and Bain alums today, and the chat is open so you can speak with one another. I'm Jen Andrasco, EVP and head of Bain's global alumni community, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by guest host Kim Burrows, who will be moderating our discussion. Kim, thanks so much for joining us. Kim is a partner in our Denver office, specializing in retail, performance improvement, and customer strategy and marketing. She's also a leader within our Women at Bain and Asians at Bain Employee Resources Group. Please join me in welcoming Kim as we kick off today's session. Kim, over to you.
Thank you, Jen, for the warm introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm very excited to be joined by Bain alumni Amy Fan today. She's a former Toronto SAC and co-founder of 28 Health, which is a mission-driven digital health platform increasing women's health access for underserved communities and individuals from low-income backgrounds. One note before we dive in, we'll do Q&A and have some time for all of you to ask Amy your questions. So please use the Q&A function frequently and robustly, and we'll make sure we leave some time to moderate. But before we go back to Amy, 28 Health offers telemedicine, medication delivery, and follow-up care, and is one of the only telehealth platforms to accept Medicaid. Their vision is to provide high-quality, comprehensive women's health care and making it accessible to all individuals, supporting them through multiple stages of life. Amy, we're so glad you could join us today. But before we get started, do you want to share a little bit about yourself, your career path to date, and maybe what you enjoy outside of work?
Sure, sounds great. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's always so exciting to be back and participating in Bain events. I started off my career, as you mentioned, at the Bain Toronto office right after graduation. During my time at Bain, I also spent 6 months as an extern at Bridgespan in San Francisco. After my SAC year, I joined a venture studio in New York to lead a dietitian platform, and ultimately ended up leading a direct-to-consumer skincare company at the venture studio. For me, I grew up in Canada, was an immigrant originally from Taiwan, and then immigrated again to the US about 9 years ago. And I also experienced, as I was living in the US, how challenging it can be to navigate the US healthcare system, even as someone who was privileged enough to have employer-sponsored insurance. It was also such a stark contrast to what I was working on, which was building skincare and beauty industry, where everything in beauty is incredibly consumer-centric. Whether it's thinking about the product formulation, the unboxing, or online experience, we develop everything for our end user and really understanding what their pain points are and what's their lifestyle, which is very different than, unfortunately, how healthcare patient experiences are created. So I wanted to bring that user-centric approach into healthcare. Went back to school, did an MBA and Masters of Public Health at UC Berkeley. And during that time, I very serendipitously met my co-founder who was at the Gates Foundation, and we decided to start 28 Health together.
That's quite the journey. Thank you for sharing that. And I know we'll get some time to dive much deeper into your thinking and rationale as you started 28 Health. But I actually want to move maybe and start a little bit further back. Would love just to hear a little bit more about your Bain experience and what your journey was to Bain, and how did you start and as you thought about your path at Bain?
Yeah, great question. So I grew up in an immigrant family in Vancouver where I didn't necessarily have the support from my parents in terms of understanding how to navigate college applications, let alone navigating how to apply for careers post-college. So I felt like me coming to Bain was really a fortunate accident where, admittedly, I think even as I was pursuing my undergraduate degree, consulting wasn't really on my radar until I got to third or fourth year of university. But through a lot of really great mentorship, talking to peers, and also meeting folks that were at Bain, I was really excited about the potential to work in a lot of industries, learn very quickly, and feel like I was able to just continue to accelerate my career. And I also really enjoyed being in the Toronto office, where at the time, back in 2011, the Toronto office was under 100 people. So you really got the opportunity to know everyone really well, whether it's your peers in the same class as you, a couple years above you, all the way up to managers and partners. And I felt like it was a really supportive ecosystem to be in.
How did your time at Bain prepare you for your time beyond Bain?
I think there's two pieces that have really stuck with me. The first is the ability to navigate ambiguity and feel a certain level of comfort, even in times of uncertainty. This is even more important, I think, when you're building a startup where there's so much that you don't know, so much that you can't control. And it's really being comfortable with finding that balance of knowing what you need to get to the next step, and also being open to learning more as you go. The other piece is being 80-20, where I think by far the most important resource at a startup is time. And there's so many different things that you could do. There's so many different ways that your attention could be diverted. And it's really about how do you make sure what you're focusing on is really going to get you to that 80% of difference.
That's great. And I think for those of us still at Bain on this call, it's a good reminder of the importance of 80-20 and why we all focus so much on it in our day-to-day jobs. I think this is a good time to pivot to 28 Health a bit. We'd just love to hear a little bit about it at a high level, and how does it work for your patients?
We provide telemedicine, medication delivery, as well as care coordination in Spanish and English. And our goal is to make the experience feel really inclusive and also feel like it could be any other high quality care provider. So if you go on our website, we don't talk a ton about the fact that we are one of the only telehealth platforms to accept Medicaid, because we wanted to feel like regardless of your income background, this is a great service for you. In terms of what it feels like for our users, so they would come onto our website, select if there's a healthcare offering they're interested in, whether that's birth control, herpes medication, prenatal vitamins, and so on. They would fill out a medical questionnaire, and then they have an option to also schedule in consultation with the doctor. After that, we handle everything related to their insurance. We help them navigate their insurance, get prior authorization if needed, and also provide any deliveries for medications if applicable.
That's great, and providing such an important service to the community. What inspired you to start 28 Health?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I grew up in an immigrant family where when we first moved to Canada, my parents were in and out of hourly wage roles because unfortunately, the experiences, education they had in Taiwan weren't necessarily valid in a similar way in Canada. However, one of the things we never had to worry about was seeing a doctor because we were living in Canada. And this was also, I think, for me, such a stark contrast when moving here and realizing that it is very complex to navigate. I remember trying to find a primary care physician who would accept me as a new patient, was in network, had time to see me outside of my working hours. And it was incredibly hard. And just thinking about, for underserved communities, additional challenges and barriers. And for example, an ability to take time off work or school, an ability to afford transportation, those barriers become even higher. So that's what also really inspired me to think about how do we build better healthcare access. The other piece is the Medicaid market, where there's over $700 billion that's spent on Medicaid annually. And so there's actually good coverage for Medicaid recipients. It's just really hard for Medicaid recipients to use. So how do we actually combine the two together to create a really great patient experience and ultimately allow people to use the coverage they have in an easier way?
How did you think about what your entrepreneurship journey would look like, and who you would bring with you along as you started to go down the path of opening 28 Health?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a certain level of naivety going in, which sometimes I think it's healthy for founders, because if you knew what every stage will look like and some of the potential challenges that might arise, I think it could actually deter people from going into startups in the first place. That being said, I think for me, one of the things that's really important was finding a co-founder where I felt like we had aligned values. I knew that was really important for me to make sure that our mission to increase access and our focus on underserved communities will always remain our North Star. And I wanted to make sure that I had a co-founder that also had similar values. The other piece is also making sure you find investors and advisors that are also aligned, because there are going to be a lot of different things that come up over time, and making sure that we all believe in the same mission allows us all to row in the same direction.
Are there elements of your journey that you feel like were particularly unique to you, either as a female founder or as an Asian female founder?
Yeah, I think one of the realities of the VC industry is that there's still less than 2% of capital that are invested in female founded startups. And that percentage is even lower if you're a woman of color, particularly for Black women and Latinx women. And I also personally experienced bias firsthand, where oftentimes women founders are questioned more. There's less emphasis put on the data that they bring, and a lot more utilization of VCs on their own anecdotal experience, where particularly in women's health, that can be a challenge because the majority of VCs are white men, and that's just the reality of the industry. So they might not have personal experience for issues that we're trying to solve and deal with.
Was there anything that you found that either helped you break through some of that bias in some of those situations, or any tactics that you think were able to help cut through the noise?
Yeah, one piece is building a really great support system around you of people that you trust, that you can go to, that will be honest about whether something's working or something is not. And I found it was really helpful to have friends on the founder side, to have friends on the venture side, where they might be working in a different industry, or they might be focused on a different sector for their investments, but would still be able to provide really great perspective. The other piece is, I think it's important to get feedback from a lot of different areas, but also recognize when feedback might be helpful and relevant and when feedback might not be. I think in general, people have really great intentions, but not everyone has the same context that you do, or the same level of information. And so I think that's another piece to always make sure to keep in mind. I think it's something that I'm still working on, but I hope I've gone better over time around what feedback I take in that I really think is helpful and productive.
Feels like it is certainly an exercise in confidence building as you're
Yes.
building that business.
Definitely. And I would say the journey of fundraising is also being able to have a lot of people say no to your face. And I think that definitely helps you to build a thicker skin, but also to grow your own conviction around what you believe in and what you really think is differentiated about what you're building.
That's great. I do want to take a step back and just ask, what's the meaning behind the name 28 Health?
Yeah, great question. So 28 is the average number of days in a menstrual cycle. So we want to find a name that alluded to women's health, but also wasn't overly obvious, recognizing that we also have different comfort levels about speaking to women's health, and particularly for our users that are receiving services from us, we also wanted to provide a certain level of discretion and privacy.
That's great. It is a name that makes perfect sense once you start to think through it. As you think about where the business is headed, what's next?
Yeah, so our vision is to become the digital healthcare home for underserved women, and supporting them through different life stages, from menstruation, pregnancy, all the way up to menopause one day. So specifically for this year, we're really excited to expand our healthcare offerings, and we'll be focusing on perinatal services. So for example, preconception consults, postpartum depression screening. In addition to that, we have some really exciting partnerships that we'll be launching this year, both with nonprofits as well as with payers.
Seems like you've got quite the year ahead of you. If folks on this call want to learn more, where would you suggest they go?
Yeah, you can find us at 20health.com. Also, you can find us on social, on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter. Admittedly, I feel like everyone on my team is too old to figure out TikTok at the moment. It is something that we're working on.
Well, once you figure it out, I hope you reach back out to me and let me know, because it is also one bridge too far on my side as well. That's wonderful. Well, I know many of our participants today will want to go check that out. So thank you for sharing that. I think if we pivot a little bit, it is Women's History Month. Who are the women in your life that have inspired you the most, and how?
Yeah, one of my biggest inspirations is my grandma, where I remember as a kid living in her apartment in Taiwan, we would practice writing Chinese characters together in afternoons while she was watching her soap operas. And this is because she never had the opportunity to go to school, and she only learned how to read and write in her 50s. And I think this embrace of learning and openness to being a beginner, no matter where you are in life, is still something that I want to carry with me moving forwards.
How have you applied that as you've been on your entrepreneurship journey?
I mean, I feel like I am constantly learning and constantly humbled. And I think it can feel really intimidating, particularly to build a business in healthcare where healthcare is complex, it is very heavily regulated. And when you move into Medicaid, it's even more confusing because Medicaid has different standards, policies, and regulations by state. And so I think remembering that, we all have to start from somewhere, and making sure that I'm focused on getting to know the most important information at the time helps me to balance being focused and also not feeling overwhelmed or daunted by the lack of things that I still don't know.
Yes, you certainly did not pick the simplest sector of our economy to jump into on your founding journey, but can see you're taking that growth mindset to heart. I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier about the crew that helped you get to where you are today and help, build the business you have. What's the role that sponsorship and advocacy has played in your career, both at Bain, but also now beyond?
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciated at Bain, I think, particularly being at a small office, was the amount of advocacy where I felt like whether it was, when I was an AC, my SAC, my CTL, my manager, or partner, everyone would go up to bat for me. And when I had a question or even thinking about exploring things beyond Bain, there was just so much support around me. And I think that is very different when you decide to start your own business, where you're in a completely different world. There is no inherent support infrastructure that is there. So it's really important to build that for yourself and build that community of folks around you. I think initially what I was really hoping to find was a mentor that I could go to for everything. Ideally, a mentor that maybe built a healthcare company a few stages ahead of me. But I think what I realized the reality is, in some ways they're kind of a unicorn mentor where they don't necessarily exist because even within healthcare, industries change so quickly and every business is different. There's going to be different issues and complications that arise, whether it's from an external market side or internally how you manage folks. So I pivoted my approach to really think about how do I build a team of folks around me that can provide different perspectives or expertise. So whether that is bringing on advisors who have experience at health plans, medical advisors, building connections with other founders, particularly other female founders, to be able to share war stories and also support each other when times are hard. And also having friends in VC that I think it is helpful to always provide that market pulse from a different lens.
Seems like you've got quite the crew supporting you, which is great. I think, as we continue to talk and explore a little bit around your career background, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever gotten? And what's the worst when it comes to career advice in particular?
So, in terms of the best advice I've received, and one that still resonates with me today, is a piece of advice I got when I was at Bain, where initially, when I was starting out, I would feel so reluctant about delivering any work because I felt like there's still so much that I don't know, and that I was so far from being the expert in any of the things that I was working on. And the advice I got was that to really think about it incrementally of delivering value. It doesn't have to solve everything today, and it's not binary around like whether it's yes, you delivered something great that meets all the marks, or no, this is absolutely terrible, but to be able to build on it over time. And I think it really helped me to think about just getting started is the most important piece. Even if it feels really daunting, just pick one piece that they start diving into, get smarter on, think about what insights you're deriving from there, and then start connecting into the broader industry. And I think that's something that's been really helpful for me as well in the startup world, to even if I'm starting from one place, to continue to build that learning over time, because I think it is very hard to try and learn everything at once about building a business, fundraising, getting smart on industry, etc. And I think the the not necessarily worst advice that I've received, but a piece of advice that really got me thinking early on in my career, particularly about women in the workplace, is that I had someone advise me that a great way to save time was to get your hair blown out every week, which I don't think it was coming from a bad place, because there is a level of impact that first impressions do make. But I've had really complicated feelings hearing that advice, because I also felt that there was so much emphasis on externally what I look like. And it really made me question, other biases of my identity that might be there, whether it's being Asian, whether it's being a woman, or whether it's generally looking younger than my age. And I think simultaneously also shed a light on the reality of the world we still live in, where unfortunately there is more burden and also more bias towards women in terms of the way they look, in terms of how people perceive their competency.
One other piece of advice that I know many in our audience are asking from you, which is one, do you have any advice for the other women who are also trying to navigate STEM fields? To your point of, there is a lot of emphasis on women that maybe there aren't on some other populations.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever easy to show up in a room where everyone looks different than you, which is still a common experience for women as well as BIPOC individuals in STEM. However, it doesn't mean that you have to go on this journey by yourself, because you can either build your own community or try to find communities. And I think that's one thing where it's been really exciting to see both organic as well as more institutionalized building of communities, whether it's for female founders, whether it's for underrepresented founders, to create those spaces to feel safe, to be able to ask questions for each other and really help lift each other up.
Back to the theme of making sure you've got your crew around you who have your back. I love that. Well, before we wrap the formal moderated portion of today's discussion and flip to the Q&A, I think it might be fun to do a little bit of a rapid fire round of questions to get to know you and what you do maybe outside of work a little bit. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. What's the current book on your nightstand or the best book you've read in the last year?
So I'm currently reading a book called Breath by James Nestor, which if any of you have read it, it is probably the most Bay Area book you'll hear about. But I do think it's really interesting to understand the science behind breathing and breath work. I think for me, it's particularly interesting because I did yoga teacher training prior to going to business school, and there's so much emphasis in yoga about breath. And it's just interesting to see kind of science that comes out thousands of years later that really supports a lot of methodologies in yoga.
I love that. I have that book on my backlog, so it may just move up the list after hearing that. How about your favorite song?
I always find favorite really hard, because to me, it's like, in what circumstance? So I think for me, one of the greatest songs for so many circumstances, It's All Coming Back to Me Now by Celine Dion, which I love for karaoke. I love for road trips. I love singing at drag shows. So I think it's just, a good pump up song all around.
And the benefit, Celine Dion is Canadian.
Definitely.
Supporting the home team. I love it. How about a go-to podcast?
Yeah, so I listen to a ton of news and business podcasts on a daily basis, because I think that's, for me, a really easy way to be able to stay up on current events. But a podcast that I really love to be able to switch my brain to a different thought pattern is a podcast called Switch on Pop. It basically dissects artists, songs, and really the intersection of music and culture. So if anyone's interested, one of the places I suggest starting out with is a 4-part analysis of Britney Spears' songs, including Toxic from last year, which is really interesting and I think might reframe the way you look at Britney Spears' music.
I love that. Can you repeat the name of the podcast one more time? Because I'm sure Britney Spears perked up a lot of ears.
Yes, it's called Switched on Pop.
Switched on Pop. Love that. And then last but not least, what are you most excited about for this upcoming month?
Yeah, so I think on a personal side, I'm based in SF. There's been a ton of great snow on the West Coast, so I'm very excited to be able to get up to Tahoe a bit more often this year, or specifically, I think in the next couple of weeks.
Well, Amy, thanks for taking us on that journey from starting at Bain and pre-Bain all the way through where you are now. Your conversation has spurred quite a few questions from folks sitting out in the audience. So if it's okay with you, we'll try and batch them a little bit by theme and spend some time going a little bit deeper.
Yeah, sounds good.
Excellent. So if we go back to Bain a little bit, a question here around what did you think about on your first day? What do you remember? What were you feeling? And then what did you go home and tell your family and friends?
um, I distinctly remember sitting in the boardroom in the Toronto office and seeing the other ACs introduce themselves and thinking like, oh my gosh, they might have hired the wrong person. Like everyone is so much more impressive. I also realized like my year probably like was a little bit skewed where one of the persons in my starting class had rowed for Team Canada for the Pan Am Games. I'm like, what have I done? um, and I think the first thing I told my parents after my first day was probably like, I don't really know what consulting is still. I'm not sure exactly what my job is, but everyone seems really great.
So at what point in your Bain career, your life, did you start to think about what might be next?
Yeah, I think for me, I love the amount of learning that was at Bain. I really loved the people and the culture. And what I felt like was missing was being able to see the direct impact of my work, where oftentimes, when you deliver something to a client, it might take a while for them to be able to actually put into action. So that's also partly why I wanted to do an externship at Birchband, where I thought going to the social sector, maybe there's more opportunities to see the impact on beneficiaries. And for me, I also think, it's the specific experience I had at Birchband and definitely not the overall experience one could have at Birchband, but I worked largely with CSR clients. So the beneficiaries were still quite a few gates away. And that's when I started thinking about, okay, maybe it makes sense to go to a smaller organization, go somewhere where I felt like there was a mission and an impact from the work itself, and being at a smaller organization where I can also see the tangible impact of what I was doing on a day-to-day basis.
What advice do you have for younger Bainies or just younger professionals in general who are trying to think about what their career could look like 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road?
I think honestly, the younger you are, the easier it is to take risks. And having Bain on your resume, it's going to open so many doors and make you highly employable. So even if you take a risk and it doesn't pan out, I think there's still so much that you could do. And for example, I know for me and some other people in my AC class, when we got to the SAC year, we thought about deferred sponsorship as well as another opportunity to maybe try out something different, see how that fits, have the opportunity to still go back to school and go back to Bain if that feels like the path that is more appropriate for you.
You raised both in your answer about your first day at Bain, but also I know a little bit earlier this idea of, oh gosh, what do I bring to the table when all these people around me seem to have rode for Team Canada, amongst other things. And some folks want to just understand a little bit, how much does imposter syndrome impact you, and how do you deal with it and keep it all in perspective?
Yeah, great question. I would say it impacts me a lot. I still feel that every day because I do think a part of building a business is that the business continues to grow and you have to grow with the business. So even if it's something that I learned, raising from angels is so different than raising from institutional VCs, and raising a pre-seed round versus seed round can be so different as well. And I think for me, it's really getting to that comfort level of there's a lot that I don't know, but there's also a lot that I do know, and a lot that I can bring to the table, and reminding myself of that, both individually as well as a business, what really differentiates 28.
Sounds like you've got to be pretty resilient to make it through the founding gauntlet. I think you mentioned getting really comfortable with people saying no to your face a lot. So how do you
Yes.
think about personal resilience within the construct of that? How do you build it for yourself, but also help your team who are building the company alongside you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from a personal side is identifying what support you individually need. So for example, during the pandemic was when I started seeing a therapist, because I felt like there were a lot of different changes, and a lot of it were really stemming from work versus personal related items, but I still felt like having therapists was really helpful to have someone to go to process everything, because I also didn't want to put that stress onto my team. In
Mhm.
terms of thinking about building resilience for a team, I think it's one, it's not something I've fully figured out. So if anyone has advice, I'm very open to it. The second piece is being transparent, where there's going to be so many things that we don't know. So, looking back on the last few years, I don't think I could have ever told you there's going to be a pandemic where we went from an in-person team to fully remote. I think there's been a lot of changes in policies that would have been hard to predict even 3 or 5 years ago, that we've kind of had to continue to figure out as we go. And I think being transparent about what we do know, what we don't know, and what our plan is has also helped everyone to feel like, okay, even with this uncertainty, we're all in this together, we're all doing our best, and we'll figure it out.
I think along that idea of, all the stress that the job put on you and, starting to go to therapy and some of those journey elements of your journey, are there particular tips or tricks or things that you've learned along the way to help stay mentally healthy, prevent burnout? It's certainly a pressure cooker, to your point of when your scarcest resource is time. Anything you would pass on to the rest of us?
Yeah, I think for me, it's thinking about what goals am I trying to achieve both at work as well as personally. From a work perspective, particularly being a founder, I think it's this constant back and forth around like, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough in the right direction? Should I be working later? Is this setting a bad example for the rest of the team? Should I be working weekends? So you question yourself a lot around, what should you do? Because there isn't a playbook that you can follow. So I think it's really important to go back to think about, okay, what are my goals? Whether it's my goals for this week, this month, this quarter, am I achieving them? And using that as a clear barometer versus trying to think about, oh, like, am I doing enough or not? Because when it's that nebulous, I think it's really easy for doubt to creep in. And then in terms of the personal side, it's also for me identifying, what are things that are really important. Recently, I listened to a podcast with Ingenuity, the former CEO of Pepsi, and she talked about how she only needs to sleep 5 or 6 hours a night. And that was actually a really big factor for her being able to do that role. And I knew for me, that was just not going to work. I think sleep was probably the hardest part about my time at Bain, where I really need to sleep 8 hours a night. But just thinking about, okay, how do I create that environment for myself to do that, as well as I think, for me, like exercising on a daily basis is a really important part of mental health. So how do I build all those pieces in and not feeling guilty about it? Because I know that's what I need to really show up as my best self for my team.
When do you feel like you cracked the code on knowing some of what you needed to feel at your best, and how much trial and error was involved before you landed on your recipe?
Yeah, a recent piece of advice I got was thinking about everything you do as an experiment. And while it's a newer piece of advice, I think even think about what I tried to do previously, it applies where, you're not necessarily going to figure out all once. So think about, okay, like this week, I'm going to try this. How does this feel? And not feeling like, oh, it didn't go well, so therefore it was like a failure and I can never do that again. But more so think that, okay, like there were things that maybe didn't go as expected. What can I tweak? And then try that the next week, and taking that almost like scientific theory approach to adopting different habits, I think it's something that has worked for me.
Love that. Just pivoting a little bit back to your journey and the role you have here at 28 Health, is you mentioned again that female founders face some particular challenges as you're looking for, funding and support. Do you have any advice for the group on just how to prepare for and navigate those challenges? As I know we've got, I'm sure, a number of folks in the audience either going through the same, journey or thinking about it.
One piece that I still try to incorporate into my thinking is recognizing that when people provide opinions or feedback, it's just as much as a reflection of themselves as it is potentially on you and your business. And to always really think about what is the context they might be coming from, as well as, what are the incentives that they have that may or may not align with yours. Because I think that's a really important part about how to navigate the space comfortably, is also to be okay to say, nope, like, that's not feedback that's helpful for me, I'm going to leave on the table. So a specific example, which I think once I share, it'll probably seem like a very obvious example, that very early on when we were trying to fundraise, I pitched to a group of healthcare investors. They were really deep in healthcare, did a lot of biopharma, as well as a little bit of digital health. So I thought, great, they're going to be such a fit. They bring a ton of expertise. And after pitching to this group of all white male VCs, I got feedback that, hey, I don't think your business is ever going to work because my teenage daughter would never use you. And initially, I felt really taken aback. I was like, oh my gosh, these are really accomplished VCs. They have invested a ton in different portfolio companies that have done really well. But then thinking about it more, I realized I don't think they understand what we're trying to do. Our focus is supporting underserved communities, namely BIPOC women, as well as women from low-income backgrounds, which my guess is his teenage daughter doesn't fit into either categories. Mm-hmm. And it also just shows the lack of reference to actual market data around the size of the market, the potential of the opportunity, or all the data that we gather around user surveys and feedback from people within this community, where he ignored all of that from our pitch deck, but really focused on this piece of anecdotal, I'm not even sure if I would say evidence, anecdotal story that he has in his head. And so I think for me, it was a good reminder of okay, that is what he believes from his context and perspective, not having been someone who maybe have had so many struggles trying to access and connect with the healthcare system. And also for me, taking a lesson of, just because on the surface they're a healthcare investor, it doesn't necessarily mean they're actually the right fit for my company.
It's important to remember that. That's a good piece of advice. I think lots of folks here are curious just as to how you get your information with healthcare changing so quickly. To your point, there's, it's always evolving, always changing. A lot of things that have happened in the last 3 to 5 years, we probably would never have anticipated. What are some of your just go-to sources, podcasts, newsletters, articles, journals, et cetera, just to help you stay on top of things?
Yeah, I get probably 15, 20 different newsletters every day related to digital health or healthcare more broadly. My way of staying on top of it, honestly, is skimming the headlines to see what's relevant. I also set up a lot of Google alerts for specific things that are top of mind for me that's related to 28. The other piece as well is that we stay really closely connected with our partners. So whether they are community-based organizations, large nonprofits, community colleges, our pharmacy partners, where they're also getting information from different places that can also be really relevant and timely.
I think some folks have been digging into 28 Health a bit while we've been here in advance of this. There's a question here around, how do you think about balancing the high quality service brand with also maybe downplaying the message that Medicaid is accepted? Do you think there's any risk that maybe some of those patients might think they're being priced out if the message is quieter?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that it was an insight that we identified really early on through doing a ton of user interviews. So before we launched 28, my co-founder and I did probably over 100 user interviews with people from this community. And a common theme, unfortunately, was how prevalent it was for them to have a negative experience. For example, we had a user that told us that she used to go to the emergency room to get birth control because she knew that was a place that wouldn't turn her away, which was her experience going to other doctors' clinics. And the other piece was the stigma around for places that would accept Medicaid, this feeling like, oh, it's going to be an inferior experience. They're not going to treat me with as much as respect as they might someone with commercial insurance. So that's why we wanted to make it seem like it is a really high quality service, regardless of your form of coverage or payment. And then the way we think about how to make sure that the message that we accept Medicaid still gets through is actually the referral partners that we work with. And that's why we work with a lot of nonprofits, community-based organizations where they're only referring services to clients in their community that they know is accessible for them, namely can accept Medicaid. So because these individuals are largely coming through these channels already, they have that trust and understanding of, okay, I'm not going to be turned away, and then being able to see something that they feel like, oh, great, like this seems like a beautiful brand and experience that's for everyone that I can also use, and not necessarily a Medicaid experience that might be inferior.
As you were navigating the healthcare system, and to your point, the fact that Medicaid is different in every city or every state rather, what was the biggest hurdle that you came up against that kind of required your whole team to band together and think about a unique or creative solve for?
I think the biggest piece is probably when policy change, and I think a lot of uncertainty around then the availability of emergency contraception. And we got a ton of users writing in, asking questions about emergency contraception, and a lot of misconceptions around what emergency contraception is. So for us, we really focus on thinking about education, whether it is through the Dr. Vetted articles that we have on our website, thinking about the monthly newsletter we have, really focusing on helping people understand, one, what emergency contraception is, what are the different methods, what are they used for, and also helping them understand if that's something they're interested in, how do we navigate them there.
Got it. And I think we've got some folks in the audience who are already thinking about your Engine 2 strategy or your next wave of growth at adjacencies. I say that, women's healthcare is a real issue in a lot of emerging markets. To what extent do you think, and I know you may not know for sure, the 28 Health model might be replicable in other geographies?
One of the inspirations for 28 Health is actually learning from emerging markets. So when my co-founder was at the Gates Foundation, he met a startup called Kasha that was providing reproductive sexual health care in Kenya and Rwanda, where they were really overcoming lack of infrastructure and stigma by using telemedicine and at-home deliveries. So I would say in some ways it's almost a reverse, where we've already learned so much about emerging markets around particularly the potential of using telemedicine and how do we apply it to low resource communities in the US. I do think there's still a lot of learnings that we can continue to apply, particularly thinking about how do we actually define accessibility? How do we define convenience as well as health equity? And those will also vary based on the culture that we're in. But I do think it's really interesting to be able to start thinking about how do we define those.
I know we're coming up rapidly on the end of time, so I think we'll pivot back a little bit to some of the more personal questions. I know, like you said, you're the daughter of immigrants. I am as well, and I know that has certainly shaped how I view the world and how I make decisions. Would be curious as to, what are the one or two things from your parents or your parents' experience that you take with you as you think about your own career choices, decision-making criteria, and all of those things?
Yeah, I think the first piece is that you're never above or you're never too good for a job. Where, for example, my dad was an engineering manager in Taiwan. And when we moved to Canada, he worked as a car washer. And I don't think he ever viewed it as a demotion in status, but really viewed as like, hey, I know it's really important to provide for my family. This is something that I can do today. And I can still take pride in having a job, working hard, and being able to deliver for my family. And I think that's a good approach to thinking about, regardless of what you're working on, that, everyone is equal. No one is above one another. And sometimes it's just about doing what it takes to get it done.
And I know, of course, no Bain discussion is good without a little bit of reflection on what could be done differently. As you look back at your journey thus far, is there anything you would change and why?
There are times where I've looked back and I sometimes think, oh, I wish I had been more intentional about certain parts of my experience. One piece that I think about as well is leaving Bain, not negotiating my salary at the venture studio because I was really hesitant about it. I never had experience at Bain, and I kind of felt like, well, I think my employer knows more than I do, so I should just take whatever they give me as long as it's something that, I feel like I can still live within my means. That being said, I think I'm trying to take the approach of thinking about those as lessons learned and what I would do differently going forward, or maybe advice I would provide to other folks. Because if something changed in the past, it might not lead me to where I am today. And overall, I'm so grateful to be able to work on something I'm so passionate about and have such a supportive team that cares a ton about what we do.
It's great. I love the confidence and comfort with the decisions that led you to here. I know we're about to wrap, but I think one question for you is, what else should we have asked you that we didn't? What do you want to make sure that we have a chance to let you share?
I feel like this is very ironic that you asked me this, because I always ask this in interviews for candidates applying 28, and I think it's usually the question that catches them off guard. And I probably should have thought about this question more before this session. I think in terms of, hopefully, if there's any takeaways from this, is for people to feel confident in where they are at today, that, I think learning is a lifelong journey, and you can start at any point, and wherever you are is a good place to be and not feel like you are behind. And also, I think just being really transparent with yourself around what you're looking for, what you need. And, if you have the appetite for risk, if you want to go try something different, go do it. But also, if that's not something that really seems like it's going to be an environment where you thrive in, that's also okay. Like, you don't always have to go after the sexy, shiny thing. And I think, maybe tech is losing its luster a little bit, but previously, I think there is so much cachet around being at a startup where there are really great benefits from it. There's so much around agency, there's so much around being able to see your impact and really work on something you're passionate about, but there's a lot of trade-offs you make simultaneously and compromises that you have to take as well. So I think it's being honest with yourself about ultimately what you're looking for. And I think hopefully that will lead you to feel more confident and comfortable in your decision.
Thank you for that, Amy. I think that is a great note to end on. On behalf of everybody at Bain, would love to thank you for your time and your wisdom. I hope everyone goes and checks out 28 Health, and best of luck, and we can't wait to see what you do next.
Thanks, everyone.